Welcome back. In this part we will be looking at optional as the means to report errors. Optional is a type that was introduced in C++ 17. It is a type that can neither hold a value or not. If we try to access the value of an optional that does not hold a value, an exception is thrown. For example, an optional integer may hold either an integer or not. An optional string can either be a string or nothing. Here's the cool part. An optional string may actually hold an empty string. This allows us to distinguish between an empty string and a missing string. In our read file example, we return an empty optional if an error occurs, otherwise we return the contents of the file. The main advantage of this approach is, while it is still rather simple, it protects the caller from accidentally accessing the payload if an error has occurred. In other words, if the caller tries to access the contents of the file without checking for an error first and an error has occurred, an exception will be thrown. Wrong code becomes harder to get away with. Furthermore, we can now distinguish between an empty file and an error, which was an issue in one of the previous approaches. On the other hand, we cannot distinguish between different errors. We can only express whether an error has occurred or not, but not what kind of error. This may be okay if we do not care about the exact error or if there is just one kind of error. Here is a more elaborate example of how we can use optional to report errors. The most interesting part is how a user of the read file function can access the contents of the file. First, they need to check if the optional holds a value. Then, if it does, they may access the value using the value function. The use of optional forces the caller to check for an error before accessing the contents of the file. If the caller tries to access the contents of the file when an error has occurred, an exception will be thrown. Remember, the goal is to make wrong code hard to get away with, and optional helps us achieve just that. To summarize, by returning an optional, we can induce an exception if the caller tries to access the contents of the payload when an error has occurred. By doing this, we are forcing the caller to check for an error before accessing the contents of the file. However, it still falls short when it comes to distinguishing between different kinds of errors.